Hi, this is Jerry Hogue,
And I'm Ryan Deerking,
and welcome to this week's chapter on the story
coming live to you from Grace Lutheran Libraries
in Lafayette, Indiana. This week we're on chapter 18, which is talking about Daniel as they go into exile. Last week we did chapters 16 and 17 together, where we talked about the two kingdoms falling and being carried away into captivity. The one that was the most significant, of course, was the tribe of Judah, the southern tribe, because it was there that the temple resided and the covenants of promise and the covenant to David about having a king on the throne permanently, long term. So when they went into exile in the southern kingdom, the land was left desolate. Unlike the northern kingdom, where the king of Assyria took them away and dispersed them among the other nations he'd conquered and then brought another people in, this land was left vacant. In this chapter, all of the leading people of Judah are taken away in captivity. And Nebuchadnezzar, like many kings of that era, takes out the most educated and the most noble princes of the land, and he takes them into the capital and makes them servants in his capital there, specifically in the palace. And I'm not talking about servants that carry water, but these Daniel and his three friends are being trained,
highly educated
for 3 years to prepare themselves to serve as the wise men in the palace, the people to whom Nebuchadnezzar would go when he was looking for answers or he wanted to counsel about some situation or question that he had. You're familiar with the story about how Daniel rose to power. The question that we want to focus on, though, is question number 5. In the book of Daniel, we see several instances where Daniel is spending time in prayer. So our question today is, what can you learn about prayer from Daniel?
Right. So there are a couple instances. We went back through the book of Daniel and tried to identify where Daniel was relying on the Lord through prayer during this time in exile. And we saw there were some very prominent areas. The first that we came across was when we had the king Nebuchadnezzar wanting to know not only what dream he had, but what that interpretation was. And so God then provided a vision to Daniel to then present to King Nebuchadnezzar to explain not only what the dream was, but how it applied to the current circumstances. So looking at how that dream, or not that dream, but how that type of prayer could be seen in our lives, we would not receive visions from God. That's clearly stated in the New Testament that no longer are people receiving visions and having these premonitions of what's taking place or going to take place and what they mean. But God certainly does act in our everyday lives and who we encounter, whether we're praying for a job or praying for some type of outcome. God, even though He's not going to reveal it to us through some type of vision, He is going to be working in our lives and through the interactions we have every day to fulfill what He has in store for us.
The other thing we noted about Daniel in those two instances in particular, where he needed an answer and he was calling on his friends to pray and fast with him as he was in prayer. The other thing we noted is that he's always studying the scriptures also when he goes to God in prayer. So as Ryan has described here, when we talk about receiving advice and input from our friends, and that it's often through those discussions that we get the answer we're looking for, one thing you can be sure is that if it's an answer from God, it's going to be aligned with His Word. Because as Ryan has said, God doesn't speak to us directly face to face. He doesn't speak to us in visions or dreams in the different ways that He spoke to people in the past. But the Scripture tells us that He's spoken to us in these last days through His Son, and His apostles and prophets have recorded for us the Word of the Son in His Holy Scriptures. So not only should we be seeking our answers there, but the input and counsel that we seek should be from friends who are also spending time in the Word and in prayer. The other thing that we noted about Daniel, particularly in the instance with Darius and the lion's den, most of us are familiar with that story. The satraps who were jealous of Daniel realized that the only way they were going to be able to entrap him, because he was such a man of good character, was something related to his faith. And so they devised this plan related to prayer. And Daniel, upon hearing that this decree had been passed, went into his room as he normally did, and he opened his windows facing Jerusalem, and he knelt down and prayed 3 times a day. Our lesson from that is not that we should open our windows and face Jerusalem, or as our friends the Muslims do, kneel down on their pad and face Mecca, but rather that prayer should be a regular part of our daily lives.
Right. And that, it's even talked about that we should not flaunt prayer in front of people, that we should do it in private. And I think that's exactly what Daniel was doing, and he was just having his viewpoint towards Jerusalem.
Right.
So that we should not make a spectacle, because then that makes us, as we are boasting, look at what I am doing. And the focus becomes on how we are praising you rather than the focus on you, on God being praised.
And you know, when you read Daniel's prayers, that his focus was definitely not on himself. The other thing that we would observe about Daniel and his prayer is not only was he always in the scriptures when he was praying, he would often fast when he prayed, but in one instance in particular, in chapter 9, he was reading the scriptures about the time of the exile, reading the prophet Jeremiah, and getting the sense of how long the time of the exile was to be. And it says in Daniel chapter 9, I understood that it was to be exactly 70 years. And in this case, knowing that that 70 years was coming to an end, he began to pray to God very specifically, going back through the scriptures all the way back to the book of Deuteronomy and the things that God had promised to do to the people if they strayed. And he began to pray for forgiveness. He was confessing the sins of the nation, himself, his fathers, all the way back to their patriarchs, and the way that they had continually fallen short of God's expectations. God would redeem them, he would save them from disaster, and they would immediately turn to other gods again. He recognized, that cycle in their behavior, their sinfulness. But he was asking God to remain true to his promise and to be a God of mercy and to provide forgiveness for them. I think that's something that should also characterize our prayers. We should always be recognizing when we go to God in prayer that we are unworthy of ourselves to even come into his presence and ask for help. But thank God that he provided Christ for us, who made a way for us to go into the Holy of Holies with great boldness and confidence to seek his grace and help in time of need.
And he also gave us the perfect prayer.
Exactly.
That if we don't know what to say, God had given us an example of what we should be praying for.
And as Martin Luther pointed out in his catechism about the Lord's Prayer, each petition in the Lord's Prayer should remind us of many things that we should be praying for. And he encouraged people to pray the Lord's Prayer, and at each step, each petition, to recognize other things and add those things to our prayer.
We hope this lesson on prayer, starting at Daniel and looking at how he sets an example for prayer, and then ultimately ending at Christ and showing how his example of prayer for us should be when we come to not only ask God for the things that we want, but also for the things that we need, and for our daily salvation.
But for now, we will end this chapter, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next week for chapter 19.